The glass towers of Meridian Corporate Plaza gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor, casting long shadows across the marble hallway, where silence hung thick like morning fog. It was the kind of silence that preceded storms, the kind that made even the most confident executives straighten their ties and quicken their pace. At precisely 9:47 on a Tuesday morning that would forever change two lives, that silence was about to be shattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen stood motionless beside his cleaning cart, a worn grey uniform bearing the faded logo of Pinnacle Cleaning Services hanging loose on his lean frame. His hands, calloused from years of manual labor, gripped the handle of an industrial mop with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned to find dignity in work others considered beneath them. The hallway stretched before him like a gleaming runway, its polished surface reflecting the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. But Marcus wasn't looking at the view. His dark eyes, tired yet alert, were focused on the woman approaching from the corner office at the far end of the corridor. Victoria Sterling moved with the predatory grace of someone who had never been told no, her designer heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that seemed to announce her importance with every step. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched the sharp lines of her tailored black suit, and her pale blue eyes held the kind of coldness that could freeze water in July. As the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, one of the most powerful consulting firms in the city, Victoria had built her reputation on precision, perfection, and an absolute intolerance for anything she deemed substandard. At 38, she commanded boardrooms filled with men twice her age, crushed competitors without blinking, and maintained control over every aspect of her empire, with the iron grip of someone who had clawed her way to the top and intended to stay there. The employees called her the Ice Queen behind her back, though never loud enough for her to hear. They spoke in hushed whispers about her legendary temper, her impossible standards, and her ability to destroy careers with a single glance. But today, as she approached the janitor standing quietly in her hallway, Victoria Sterling had no idea that she was about to meet someone whose quiet strength would challenge everything she believed about power. Marcus had been working the night shift at Meridian Plaza for 3 years, arriving after the executives went home to their suburban mansions and leaving before they returned to their air-conditioned offices. He was part of the invisible army of workers who kept the corporate machine running, the people who ensured that every surface gleamed and every trash bin was empty when the real business began. To most of the executives who occasionally glimpsed him in the early morning hours, he was nothing more than part of the building's furniture, as unremarkable as the potted plants or the motivational posters hanging in the break rooms. But Marcus Chen carried secrets that would have surprised those who dismissed him so easily. Behind his quiet demeanor and humble uniform was a mind that had once commanded attention in lecture halls and boardrooms, a voice that had once shaped policy and influenced decisions that affected thousands of lives. Before the cleaning cart and the night shifts, before the worn uniform and the invisible existence, Marcus had been someone else entirely. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the edges of Victoria's diamond earrings as she drew closer, her expression already showing signs of the irritation that seemed to be her default emotion. She had been having a particularly difficult morning, starting with a conference call with investors who had questioned her latest acquisition strategy, followed by a heated argument with her assistant about scheduling conflicts, and ending with the discovery that her usual coffee shop had gotten her order wrong for the 3rd time this week. Small irritations, perhaps, but for someone accustomed to absolute control, they felt like personal affronts. Marcus sensed her approach before he saw her, the way animals sense approaching storms. He had learned to read the moods of the building's occupants through subtle cues, the speed of footsteps, the set of shoulders, the tone of voices echoing off the marble walls. Victoria Sterling's footsteps carried a particular urgency this morning, a sharp staccato rhythm that spoke of barely contained frustration seeking an outlet. The collision between their worlds was as inevitable as gravity. As Victoria rounded the corner where Marcus was methodically cleaning the baseboards near the executive elevator, her phone buzzed with what appeared to be another crisis demanding her immediate attention. Without looking up from the screen, she barked out her first words to him in 3 years of sharing the same building. "You missed a spot near the elevator yesterday," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. The board members noticed. "It's unacceptable." Marcus straightened slowly, setting down his cleaning supplies with deliberate care. He had perfected the art of making himself small, of deflecting conflict before it could escalate, but something in Victoria's tone this morning felt different. There was an edge to her voice that went beyond simple dissatisfaction with his work, a cruelty that seemed almost personal despite the fact that they had never truly spoken before. "I'll take care of it right away, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice steady and respectful. He reached for his supplies, intending to address whatever imperfection she had identified, but Victoria wasn't finished. "You people need to understand that this is a professional environment," she continued, her pale eyes finally lifting from her phone to fix him with a stare that could have cut glass. "Every detail matters here. Every surface, every corner, every inch of this building reflects on the company's reputation. When you do substandard work, you're not just failing yourself, you're failing everyone who works here." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus had heard variations of this speech before, from other executives who felt the need to remind him of his place in their hierarchy. Usually he absorbed such comments with the practiced patience of someone who had learned that dignity came not from how others treated you, but from how you treated yourself. But something about Victoria's delivery, the particular venom in her voice, struck a different chord. "I understand, ma'am," Marcus said quietly, his tone remaining respectful despite the heat he could feel building in his chest. "I take pride in my work." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless, the kind of sound that could shatter crystal. "Pride?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You're a janitor. You clean up other people's messes. What exactly is there to take pride in?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because it was particularly cruel, but because it revealed something fundamental about how Victoria Sterling saw the world. In her universe, worth was measured solely by position and power, by the height of one's office and the number of zeros in one's salary. The idea that someone like Marcus could find dignity in honest work, could take pride in contributing to something larger than himself, was not just foreign to her but actively offensive. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a wall that he had built over years of quiet acceptance beginning to crack. He thought of his daughter Emma, now 16 and preparing for college applications, who had grown up believing that her father was a hero for working 2 jobs to keep food on their table. He thought of the letters she had written to him over the years, thanking him for his sacrifices and telling him how proud she was to be his daughter. In Emma's eyes, his work had never been just cleaning, it had been love made visible, care expressed through action. "Every job has dignity if it's done with purpose," Marcus said, his voice still quiet but carrying a new weight. "I help create an environment where people can do their best work. That matters to me." Victoria's eyes narrowed, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around her phone. She was accustomed to immediate deference from the service staff, to nods and apologies and quick scurrying away. Marcus's calm response, his refusal to be diminished by her words, felt like insubordination of the highest order. "Don't lecture me about purpose," she snapped, taking a step closer to where Marcus stood. "I run a company that employs hundreds of people and generates millions in revenue. Your job is to push a mop around and empty trash cans. There's no comparison." The hallway seemed to grow smaller around them, the morning light streaming through the windows creating harsh shadows that divided the marble floor into zones of brightness and darkness. Other early arrivals had begun to appear at the far end of the corridor, executives and assistants who sensed the tension in the air and slowed their pace to observe the confrontation unfolding between the CEO and the janitor. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, could sense the mixture of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment that such scenes inevitably generated. He knew that the smart thing, the safe thing, would be to apologize and retreat, to restore the natural order that Victoria Sterling expected and that the watching executives would find comfortable. But something about the morning light and the weight of years spent invisible, something about the thought of Emma reading about this moment if it ever reached her ears, made retreat impossible. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the marble expanse with surprising clarity. "There's no comparison. Your job is to make money for shareholders. Mine is to make sure people have a clean, safe place to work. We both serve a purpose." The watching crowd grew larger, drawn by the unprecedented sight of someone standing their ground against Victoria Sterling. Whispers began to ripple through the gathering, executives and assistants exchanging glances that mixed shock with something that might have been admiration. No one could remember the last time anyone had challenged the Ice Queen so directly, so calmly, so completely without fear. Victoria's face flushed red beneath her carefully applied makeup, her professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone she considered so far beneath her notice. The fact that Marcus remained calm while she felt her control slipping only intensified her fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I could have you fired with a single phone call. I could make sure you never work in this city again." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, heavy and acrid and impossible to ignore. The watching crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if Marcus would finally break, finally show the fear that Victoria's reputation demanded. They expected him to crumble, to apologize, to beg for mercy like so many others had done when faced with the Ice Queen's wrath. Instead, Marcus stood a little straighter, his dark eyes meeting Victoria's pale blue stare with unwavering steadiness. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the watching crowd had to strain to hear him, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. "That's your choice to make," he said simply, "but threatening someone's livelihood because they disagreed with you says more about your character than it does about mine." The words hit Victoria like a slap across the face, their simple truth cutting through her anger to strike at something deeper.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She had built her entire identity around the idea that power justified everything, that success excused any behavior, that being right was more important than being kind. Marcus's calm observation forced her to confront the possibility that she had been wrong about something far more fundamental than cleaning standards or workplace hierarchies. The crowd of onlookers had grown to include nearly everyone on the floor, executives and assistants and support staff, all drawn by the magnetic pull of conflict. They formed a loose semicircle around Victoria and Marcus, creating an impromptu arena where two very different worldviews were about to clash in ways that none of them could have predicted. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she raised her phone, her finger hovering over the contact information for the building's management company. One call would end Marcus's employment immediately, would remove this irritating reminder that her authority could be questioned. One call would restore the natural order of things, would put this presumptuous janitor back in his place, and remind everyone watching that challenging Victoria Sterling carried consequences. But as she looked at Marcus standing calmly before her, his dignity intact despite her threats, something unexpected happened. For just a moment, Victoria Sterling saw herself through his eyes, and what she saw made her pause. She saw a woman so insecure in her own worth that she needed to diminish others to feel powerful, so afraid of losing control that she resorted to threats when faced with simple disagreement. The moment of self-awareness passed quickly, buried beneath years of conditioning that told her weakness was the ultimate sin. Victoria's finger moved toward her phone's screen, ready to make the call that would end Marcus Chen's quiet rebellion once and for all. "Go ahead," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying clearly across the marble hallway. "But before you do, let me ask you something. Do you really think destroying someone's job makes you more powerful, or does it just make you someone who destroys things?" The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge that could either connect two very different worlds or collapse under the weight of pride and prejudice. Victoria's finger remained poised over her phone, but something in Marcus's calm certainty made her hesitate. Around them, the crowd of onlookers waited in breathless silence, sensing that they were witnessing more than just a confrontation between a CEO and a janitor. They were watching a moment of truth that would define not just the characters of the two people at its center, but the character of everyone who chose to stand by and watch. Marcus had spent 3 years learning the rhythms of this building, understanding its moods and patterns with the thoroughness of someone whose livelihood depended on being invisible. He knew that Victoria Sterling typically arrived at the office between 9:30 and 10, depending on traffic and the complexity of her morning routine. He knew that she preferred the executive elevator and grew irritated when it was delayed even by seconds. He knew that she drank her coffee black with exactly 1 packet of artificial sweetener and that she had fired 2 assistants in the past year for getting her order wrong. What Marcus didn't know, what no one in the building knew, was why Victoria Sterling had become the Ice Queen. They didn't know about the nights she spent alone in her penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights and wondering when success had stopped feeling like victory and started feeling like imprisonment. They didn't know about the family dinners she missed, the friendships she had sacrificed, the parts of herself she had buried beneath layers of professional armor. Victoria had learned early in her career that kindness was perceived as weakness, that showing emotion was professional suicide, that the only way to earn respect in a man's world was to become harder and colder than any man dared to be. She had adopted ruthlessness as a survival strategy, using fear as a tool to maintain control over situations that often felt overwhelming. But standing in the marble hallway of Meridian Plaza, facing a janitor who refused to be intimidated by her threats, Victoria found herself remembering a different version of herself. She remembered the young woman who had entered the business world full of idealism, who had believed that success could be achieved without compromising one's humanity. That woman felt like a stranger now, buried so deeply beneath years of calculated cruelty that Victoria sometimes wondered if she had ever really existed. Marcus watched the play of emotions across Victoria's face, recognizing the internal struggle that most people would have missed. His years of working with people in crisis, his experience reading the subtle signs of distress and desperation, had taught him to see beyond the masks that people wore to protect themselves from the world. He saw not just the Ice Queen who terrorized her employees, but the frightened woman who had convinced herself that being feared was the same as being respected. "I've been cleaning these floors for 3 years, Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "I've seen you arrive early and leave late, working weekends and holidays, carrying the weight of this entire company on your shoulders. I've seen you care more about the success of this business than most of the people who work here. That's not worthless. That's not something to be ashamed of." The unexpected kindness in his words hit Victoria like cold water on overheated skin, shocking in its gentleness after years of interactions built on competition and conflict. She looked at Marcus with new eyes, seeing not just the uniform and the cleaning cart, but the man who had noticed her dedication when everyone else took it for granted. "But threatening someone's livelihood because they see dignity in honest work," Marcus continued, his voice remaining steady and calm, "that's not strength. That's fear wearing a crown." The watching crowd stirred restlessly, sensing the shift in the conversation's dynamic. What had started as a typical display of executive power was transforming into something more complex, more human. Some of the observers began to look uncomfortable, recognizing themselves in Victoria's behavior, remembering their own moments of casual cruelty toward those they considered beneath their notice. Victoria's phone felt heavy in her hand, its weight seeming to increase with every passing second. The contact information for the building's management glowed on her screen, waiting for her to make the call that would restore her authority and eliminate this challenge to her worldview. All she had to do was tap the screen, speak a few words, and Marcus Chen would become someone else's problem. But as she looked into Marcus's dark eyes, Victoria saw something that stopped her cold. She saw no fear, no desperation, no pleading for mercy. Instead, she saw a quiet acceptance of consequences, a man who had spoken his truth regardless of the cost and was prepared to face whatever came next. It was a kind of courage that Victoria had forgotten existed, a strength that didn't depend on power over others, but came from something deeper and more lasting. "You think you know me," Victoria said, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed emotion. "You think you understand what it takes to build something, to create jobs, to compete in a world that destroys the weak without mercy. I think you've forgotten who you were before you became what you thought you needed to be," Marcus replied gently. "I think you've been fighting so long that you've forgotten what you're fighting for." The words hit Victoria with the force of revelation, cutting through years of carefully constructed defenses to strike at truths she had buried so deeply that she had convinced herself they no longer existed. She remembered the young woman who had started her first business not for money or power, but because she believed she could make the world a little better. She remembered the satisfaction of helping small companies grow, of creating opportunities for people who had been overlooked by larger firms. When had that mission transformed into mere acquisition of wealth and influence? When had helping others become secondary to defeating competitors? When had she stopped measuring success by the positive impact she created and started measuring it only by the fear she inspired? The marble hallway felt smaller now, the watching crowd pressed closer, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. But Victoria could feel their eyes on her, could sense their anticipation as they waited to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve itself. Some of them had probably been on the receiving end of her harsh words, had felt the sting of her criticism or the weight of her impossible demands. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Marcus asked, his voice so quiet that Victoria had to lean forward to hear him clearly. "I see someone who's been carrying the weight of the world for so long that she's forgotten it's okay to put it down sometimes. I see someone who's been fighting battles for so long that she's forgotten some fights aren't worth winning." Victoria's breath caught in her throat, the phone in her hand suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. No one had spoken to her with such gentle honesty in years, perhaps decades. Her employees feared her too much to offer genuine feedback, her business associates respected her too much to challenge her methods, and she had long ago eliminated anyone from her personal life who might have dared to suggest that her approach to success was costing her more than she realized. "I don't need your psychology," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its earlier venom. "I need employees who do their jobs without questioning authority." "No," Marcus said firmly, shaking his head with quiet certainty. "You need people who care enough about their work to do it right, not people who are too afraid to tell you when something isn't working. Fear might get you compliance, but it'll never get you excellence." The truth of his words resonated through the hallway like a bell struck in a cathedral, clear and pure and impossible to ignore. Victoria realized that Marcus had just articulated something she had been struggling with for months without recognizing it. Despite all her demands for perfection, despite all her threats and ultimatums, the quality of work at Sterling Dynamics had been declining. Employees did exactly what was asked of them and no more, contributing the bare minimum required to avoid her wrath but never offering the kind of innovative thinking or passionate commitment that true excellence demanded. She had created an environment where people were so focused on avoiding mistakes that they had stopped taking risks, stopped pushing boundaries, stopped caring about anything beyond their own survival. In her quest for total control, Victoria had built a company full of people who did their jobs, but had no investment in the company's success beyond their paychecks. "You think you're so wise," Victoria said, but the edge had gone out of her voice, replaced by something that might have been exhaustion. Standing there with your mop and your philosophy, judging people whose responsibilities you couldn't begin to understand. "I'm not judging you," Marcus replied, his dark eyes reflecting a compassion that Victoria found both infuriating and oddly comforting. "I'm seeing you. Maybe for the first time someone is actually seeing you instead of just reacting to your title." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, connecting two people who had spent years existing in the same building without truly acknowledging each other's humanity. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she had built around her heart beginning to crumble under the gentle pressure of genuine recognition. Around them, the crowd continued to grow as word of the confrontation spread through the building's communication networks. Executives and assistants, security guards and maintenance workers, all drawn by the unprecedented sight of someone standing toe-to-toe with the legendary Ice Queen and emerging not just unbroken but somehow victorious through the simple act of refusing to be diminished. Victoria's finger hovered over her phone's screen, the contact information for the building management still glowing like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. One touch would end this conversation, would restore the comfortable distance between CEO and janitor, would eliminate the uncomfortable mirror that Marcus Chen had held up to reflect her own behavior back at her. But as she looked at the man standing calmly before her, Victoria Sterling found herself asking a question she hadn't considered in years. What kind of person did she want to be? Not what kind of CEO, not what kind of competitor, not what kind of force in the marketplace, but what kind of human being. The answer that came to her was both surprising and terrifying in its simplicity. She wanted to be someone worthy of the respect that Marcus had shown her, someone who could inspire loyalty through leadership rather than demand compliance through fear. She wanted to be someone who could look in the mirror without flinching, someone who could be proud not just of what she had accomplished but of how she had accomplished it.
The realization hit Victoria with the force of lightning, illuminating corners of her consciousness that had been dark for so long that she had forgotten they existed. She had become so focused on being powerful that she had forgotten the difference between power and strength, so concentrated on being feared that she had lost sight of the possibility of being loved. Marcus watched the transformation beginning to unfold across Victoria's features, recognizing the moment when a person's carefully constructed worldview starts to crack under the pressure of truth. He had seen it before, in counseling sessions and crisis interventions, the exact instant when someone realized that the story they had been telling themselves about their life might not be the whole truth. "What would you do?" Victoria asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you were in my position, with my responsibilities, how would you handle it differently?" The question surprised Marcus with its vulnerability, its implicit admission that Victoria was genuinely seeking guidance rather than simply defending her position. It was the kind of question that required careful consideration, the kind of response that could either build a bridge or burn one depending on the wisdom of the words chosen. "I'd remember that every person in this building has a story," Marcus said thoughtfully, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "The security guard in the lobby is putting 3 kids through college. The woman who brings you coffee every morning is saving money to bring her parents here from another country. The man who cleans your office is working 2 jobs to pay for his daughter's medical treatments." Victoria felt her breath catch as Marcus continued, his words painting pictures of lives she had never bothered to consider, stories of struggle and sacrifice that had been playing out around her for years without her notice. "When you see people as just their jobs, you miss everything that makes them human," Marcus said gently. "When you lead with fear, you get the minimum of what people have to offer. When you lead with respect, you get the maximum." The marble hallway had grown quiet around them, the watching crowd sensing that something profound was happening, something that went far beyond a simple workplace confrontation.
Even the building itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see which version of Victoria Sterling would emerge from this moment of reckoning. Victoria's phone screen dimmed as she failed to make the call that would have ended Marcus's employment, the contact information fading into darkness like a threat that had lost its power. She looked at the device in her hand as if seeing it for the first time, recognizing it not as a tool of communication but as a weapon she had been prepared to use against someone whose only crime was refusing to be diminished by her words. "I've spent so many years building walls," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying a sadness that seemed to echo off the marble surfaces around them. "I told myself it was protection, that I needed to be harder than everyone else to survive. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that walls don't just keep others out, they keep you in." Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing the courage it took for someone like Victoria Sterling to admit vulnerability in front of so many witnesses. "Walls have their place," he agreed. "But they should have doors too, and windows, ways to let light in and love out." The conversation had transformed the sterile corporate hallway into something approaching sacred space, a place where two people from completely different worlds had found common ground in the simple recognition of shared humanity. The watching crowd seemed to sense the shift, their earlier anticipation of conflict replaced by a respectful silence that honored what they were witnessing. Victoria looked around at the faces surrounding them, seeing her employees with new eyes. These weren't just names on payroll records or numbers in productivity reports. They were people with hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments, families they loved and responsibilities they carried. Each one had chosen to spend their days helping build something larger than themselves, and she had repaid that choice with suspicion and criticism rather than gratitude and respect. "I don't know how to be different," Victoria admitted, her voice breaking slightly with the weight of years of accumulated regret. "I've been the Ice Queen for so long that I'm not sure there's anything else left underneath." "There's always something else left," Marcus said with quiet certainty. "The question is whether you're brave enough to find it." The challenge in his words was gentle but unmistakable, an invitation to embark on the hardest journey of all, the trip back to one's authentic self. Victoria felt the weight of that invitation, understanding instinctively that accepting it would mean dismantling everything she thought she knew about strength and success, and rebuilding her entire approach to leadership from the ground up. But as she looked into Marcus Chen's compassionate eyes, Victoria Sterling realized that she was tired of being afraid. Tired of ruling through intimidation, tired of measuring her worth by others' fear, tired of the lonely isolation that came with being untouchable. For the first time in years she wanted to risk being vulnerable, to try leading with her heart instead of her armor. The phone in Victoria's hand finally went completely dark, its screen reflecting nothing but the morning light streaming through the windows of Meridian Plaza. Around them, the crowd of onlookers began to sense that the confrontation was reaching some kind of resolution, though none of them could have predicted the form that resolution would ultimately take. What happened next would become the stuff of corporate legend, a story that would be retold in break rooms and boardrooms for years to come. But in that moment, standing in a marble hallway between the past and the future, Victoria Sterling and Marcus Chen were simply two people who had found the courage to see each other clearly, perhaps for the first time in their lives. The silence that followed Victoria's admission stretched across the marble hallway like morning mist, delicate and transformative. Marcus could see the precise moment when her carefully constructed facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the woman she had buried beneath years of corporate warfare. The watching crowd remained frozen in place, sensing they were witnessing something far more significant than a workplace dispute between executive and employee. Dr. Marcus Chen had not always pushed a cleaning cart through the pristine corridors of corporate towers. 15 years earlier, his name had commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, his expertise sought by Fortune 500 companies struggling with organizational dysfunction and leadership crises. As one of the nation's most respected industrial psychologists and corporate consultants, Marcus had built a reputation for seeing through the masks that powerful people wore, for understanding the human dynamics that drove business success or failure. His doctorate from Harvard Business School had been just the beginning.
Marcus had spent a decade studying under mentors who taught him that true leadership was about service, not dominance, about building people up rather than tearing them down. His consulting firm, Chen Strategic Solutions, had grown from a one-man operation to a team of 30 specialists who worked with companies to transform toxic cultures into thriving communities of innovation and collaboration. The irony was not lost on Marcus that he now stood before Victoria Sterling, displaying exactly the kind of leadership crisis he had once been paid millions to resolve. But life had a way of stripping away everything you thought defined you, leaving only the essence of who you truly were beneath all the titles and accomplishments. The turning point had come on a rainy Thursday evening in October 7 years ago when Marcus received the phone call that shattered his world into pieces too small to reassemble. Emma, his brilliant 16-year-old daughter who shared his love of psychology and dreamed of following in his footsteps, had been struck by a drunk driver while walking home from her part-time job at the local library. The impact had left her paralyzed from the waist down, her spine crushed in 3 places, her dreams of playing college tennis and studying abroad reduced to memories of a life that would never be. The medical bills had come first, astronomical sums that insurance covered only partially, leaving Marcus to mortgage his future against his daughter's present needs. Experimental treatments, specialized equipment, physical therapy sessions that cost more per hour than most people earned in a day, all of it necessary and none of it guaranteed to restore what had been taken from Emma in a single moment of someone else's carelessness. Marcus had liquidated his consulting firm, selling client contracts and employee relationships to competitors who promised to maintain the high standards he had established. He had mortgaged his house, cashed in his retirement accounts, sold everything he owned of value to pay for treatments that offered hope measured in percentages and possibilities rather than certainties. But money had been only the beginning of what Marcus lost in those dark months following Emma's accident. The demanding schedule of her care, the constant travel between specialists in different cities, the emotional exhaustion of watching his daughter struggle to rebuild her sense of self, all of it had made maintaining his high-profile consulting career impossible. Clients who had once competed for his attention grew tired of cancelled meetings and delayed reports. Gradually, inevitably, his professional network had moved on to other experts, other solutions, other sources of the insights he had once provided. When the last of his savings had been exhausted and Emma's medical needs showed no signs of diminishing, Marcus had faced a choice that would have broken a lesser man. He could declare bankruptcy, accept charity, admit defeat and rely on the kindness of others to provide for his daughter's ongoing care. Or he could find a way to rebuild from nothing, to create a new foundation for their lives that might lack the prestige of his former career, but would provide the stability Emma needed to focus on her recovery. Marcus had chosen dignity over pride, service over status. He had taken the first job he could find that offered health insurance and steady hours, accepting a position with Pinnacle Cleaning Services that paid a fraction of his former consulting fees, but provided the medical coverage Emma required. The work was honest, necessary, and allowed him to maintain the flexible schedule needed to drive Emma to therapy appointments and doctor visits. What his former colleagues and clients never knew, what the executives who passed him in the hallways of Meridian Plaza could never have imagined, was that Marcus Chen had not stopped being a psychologist when he started pushing a cleaning cart. His understanding of human behavior, his ability to read the subtle signs of organizational dysfunction, his insights into the dynamics that made teams successful or dysfunctional, all of these skills remained as sharp as ever. During his 3 years at Meridian Plaza, Marcus had observed Victoria Sterling with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades helping executives recognize their blind spots and overcome the psychological barriers to effective leadership. He had watched her interactions with employees, noted the patterns of behavior that revealed her deep-seated insecurities, recognized the defense mechanisms she employed to maintain control in situations where she felt threatened. He had seen her arrive at the office before dawn on days when major deals were being negotiated, had observed her pacing the executive conference room while talking on the phone with investors who questioned her strategies. He had noticed the way she isolated herself during moments of crisis, the way she pushed away anyone who tried to offer support or alternative perspectives. Most tellingly, Marcus had recognized the profound loneliness that drove Victoria's need to dominate every interaction, her fear that showing any vulnerability would somehow diminish her in the eyes of others. Standing in the marble hallway, facing Victoria's moment of unprecedented honesty, Marcus felt the familiar surge of professional insight that had once made him one of the most sought-after consultants in corporate America. But now, instead of delivering his observations in a conference room surrounded by flip charts and strategic planning documents, he was offering them to someone who desperately needed to hear them, regardless of whether she had the budget to pay for his expertise. The loneliest people are often those who have convinced themselves that being needed is the same as being loved, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying the psychological foundations of leadership. When you make people afraid to disagree with you, you lose access to their best thinking. When you make them afraid to show weakness, you lose access to their humanity. Victoria's breath caught as Marcus's words struck at truths she had spent years avoiding. She had built her entire professional identity around the idea that respect was something that could be demanded rather than earned, that fear and admiration were essentially the same thing. The possibility that her approach to leadership was not just ineffective but actively counterproductive challenged everything she believed about power and success. "You don't understand the pressure," Victoria said, but her voice lacked the venom that had characterized her earlier statements. "Every decision I make affects hundreds of jobs, millions of dollars in revenue. There's no room for sentiment when that much is at stake." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the rationalization that many executives used to justify behavior that they knew, on some level, was harmful to both themselves and others. "I've worked with CEOs who managed larger companies, with more employees and higher stakes," he said simply. "The ones who succeeded long-term were the ones who understood that people don't give their best effort to someone they're afraid of. They save their best work for leaders who make them feel valued." The crowd surrounding them had grown larger, drawn by words spreading through the building's informal communication networks, that something extraordinary was happening on the 42nd floor. Executives who had been in meetings, assistants who had been preparing for the day's appointments, maintenance workers and security guards who had heard rumors of a confrontation between the Ice Queen and a janitor, all had found reasons to pass through the marble hallway to witness this unprecedented scene. Among the watchers was David Kim, Sterling Dynamics' chief financial officer, who had worked with Victoria for over 8 years and had never seen her engage in anything approaching a genuine conversation with a member of the building's service staff. David had often wondered what had happened to the idealistic young entrepreneur who had started Sterling Dynamics with a mission to help small businesses compete more effectively against larger competitors. That woman had seemed to disappear gradually, replaced by someone who measured success solely in terms of market share and profit margins. Also watching was Sarah Martinez, Victoria's executive assistant, who had been considering resignation for months due to the stress of working for someone who seemed incapable of acknowledging any contribution that didn't directly advance her own agenda. Sarah had seen Victoria reduce other assistants to tears with her criticism, had watched talented employees leave the company rather than continue working in an environment where every mistake was treated as a personal betrayal. Near the back of the growing crowd stood James Peterson, the night security guard who had worked at Meridian Plaza for over a decade. James knew Marcus better than anyone else in the building, having shared many conversations during the quiet hours when the corporate world slept and the building belonged to those who maintained it. James had always sensed that Marcus was more than he appeared to be, had noticed the way the janitor carried himself with a dignity that seemed to come from some source deeper than his current circumstances. "Tell me about pressure,"
Marcus said to Victoria, his voice taking on the gentle but probing tone he had once used in executive coaching sessions. Tell me about the weight you carry that makes kindness seem like a luxury you can't afford. Victoria felt something inside her chest loosen at the unexpected invitation to be heard rather than judged. For years she had been surrounded by people who either wanted something from her or were afraid to challenge her perspectives. The idea that someone might actually be interested in understanding her motivations rather than simply complying with her demands felt foreign and oddly comforting. Every morning I wake up knowing that thousands of people depend on the decisions I make. Victoria began, her voice growing stronger as she found words for feelings she had never articulated. Employees who need their jobs to support their families, investors who have trusted me with their money, clients who are counting on us to solve problems that could destroy their businesses if we fail. Marcus listened with the focused attention that had made him legendary in his former profession, noting not just Victoria's words but the body language that revealed the emotional cost of carrying such responsibility without adequate support systems. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly when she wasn't consciously controlling them, the exhaustion that lived behind her eyes despite her outward projection of confidence. That kind of responsibility can become a prison if you let it, Marcus observed, especially when you convince yourself that you have to carry it alone. I am alone, Victoria replied, the admission escaping before she could stop it. Everyone around me wants something, needs something, expects something. I can't show weakness because the moment I do, they'll lose confidence. The moment they lose confidence, everything I've built starts to crumble. The raw honesty in Victoria's voice created ripples of discomfort among the watching crowd. Many of them had never considered the psychological burden of executive leadership, had never thought about the isolation that came with making decisions that affected so many lives. They had seen only Victoria's harsh exterior, never imagining the fear and loneliness that drove her need to maintain perfect control. Marcus recognized the classic symptoms of what psychologists called executive isolation syndrome, a condition he had encountered countless times in his consulting work. Leaders who had convinced themselves that vulnerability was weakness often created environments where honest feedback became impossible, where every interaction was filtered through power dynamics that prevented genuine connection. The most successful leaders I've worked with learned to see vulnerability as a source of strength rather than weakness, Marcus said. They understood that admitting uncertainty doesn't make people lose confidence in your judgment, it makes them trust your honesty. Victoria shook her head, her platinum hair catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. You're talking about a different world than the one I live in. My competitors would destroy me if they sensed any weakness. My board would replace me if they thought I couldn't handle the pressure. Would they? Marcus asked gently. Or have you created an image of strength that's so brittle, it requires constant maintenance? Sometimes the things we do to protect ourselves end up being the things that hurt us most. The question hit Victoria like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility that her entire approach to leadership was built on false assumptions about what people actually wanted from their leaders. She thought about her board of directors, most of whom she had known for years before ascending to the CEO position. Had they really wanted a ruthless automaton, or had they simply adapted to the persona she had presented to them? She thought about her management team, talented executives who had learned to present her with solutions rather than problems, who had stopped bringing her innovative ideas that might be perceived as criticism of existing strategies. Had she created an environment where the very creativity and critical thinking that drove business success had been systematically discouraged? Most painfully, Victoria thought about her relationship with her younger sister, the only family she had left, who had stopped calling months ago after a confrontation about Victoria's inability to make time for anyone who wasn't directly connected to business success. Her sister had accused her of becoming someone unrecognizable, of losing touch with the values their parents had taught them about the importance of relationships and community. I don't know how to be different, Victoria repeated, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the building's heating and ventilation systems. I've been playing this role for so long that I'm not sure there's anyone real left underneath it. Marcus felt his heart ache with recognition. He had seen this moment countless times in his former career, the instant when successful people realized that their achievements had come at a cost they were only beginning to understand. It was the moment when healing could begin, but only if the person was brave enough to continue the journey toward authenticity. There's always someone real underneath, Marcus said with quiet certainty. The question is whether you're ready to let her breathe again. Around them, the crowd had grown to include nearly everyone who worked on the 42nd floor, creating an impromptu amphitheater in the marble hallway. Conversations that should have been happening in conference rooms were delayed. Meetings that should have started at 10 o'clock were forgotten, as everyone present recognized that they were witnessing something that would change the dynamics of their workplace forever. Victoria looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing her employees with new eyes. She recognized David Kim, whose financial analyses had saved the company millions of dollars, but whose suggestions about improving employee benefits had been dismissed as too expensive. She saw Sarah Martinez, whose organizational skills kept Victoria's complex schedule running smoothly, but whose ideas about streamlining communication processes had been ignored because they came from an assistant rather than an executive. For the first time in years, Victoria realized that she was surrounded by people who possessed talents and insights that could benefit the company enormously, if only she had been willing to listen to perspectives that differed from her own. Her insistence on maintaining absolute control had not just isolated her personally, it had deprived Sterling Dynamics of the collective wisdom of its most dedicated employees. "What would you do?" Victoria asked Marcus, her voice carrying a vulnerability that no one in the building had ever heard from her before. "If you were starting over, knowing what you know now, how would you build something different?" The question revealed more than Victoria realized. In asking for guidance, she was acknowledging that Marcus possessed expertise that could benefit her, that his insights had value regardless of his current job title. It was the first crack in the wall of assumptions that had separated executives from service staff, the beginning of recognition that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. Marcus considered his response carefully, understanding that his next words would either build a bridge toward transformation or reinforce the barriers that had kept Victoria isolated for so long. He thought about the executives he had helped during his consulting career, the leaders who had found the courage to change their approach and had discovered that authenticity was far more powerful than any mask they had worn. "I'd start by admitting that I don't have all the answers," Marcus said thoughtfully. "I'd tell my team that I needed their help, their perspectives, their honest feedback about what was working and what wasn't. I'd create space for people to disagree with me without fear of retaliation." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest as Marcus spoke, a loosening of tension she had carried for so long that she had forgotten it was there. The idea of asking for help, of admitting uncertainty, felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. She had spent so many years being the person everyone turned to for answers that she had forgotten what it felt like to be curious, to learn, to grow. "But what if they lose respect for me?" Victoria asked, voicing the fear that had driven so many of her leadership decisions. "What if admitting uncertainty makes them think I'm not capable of doing my job? The people worth leading will respect you more for your honesty," Marcus replied. "The ones who would lose respect for vulnerability are the ones whose opinions shouldn't matter to you anyway." The truth of his words resonated through the marble hallway like a bell struck in a cathedral. Several members of the watching crowd found themselves nodding unconsciously, recognizing their own experiences with leaders who had earned their loyalty through authenticity rather than intimidation. They began to see Victoria not as the untouchable ice queen, but as a person struggling with challenges that, while different in scale, were fundamentally human. David Kim stepped forward from the crowd, his movement causing a ripple of surprise among the other observers.
As CFO, David had rarely challenged Victoria's decisions directly, having learned that disagreement was often met with sharp criticism that made future collaboration difficult. But something about the conversation he had just witnessed gave him courage to speak. "Victoria," David said, his voice carrying across the marble expanse, "I've wanted to tell you for years that your leadership has kept this company profitable during some very difficult economic times, but I've also wanted to tell you that we could be so much more than profitable. We could be the kind of company that people are proud to work for, not just afraid to leave." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and potentially dangerous. David knew that speaking so directly to Victoria in front of so many witnesses could result in his termination, but he also knew that the moment called for courage rather than caution. He had watched talented employees leave Sterling Dynamics, not because they didn't believe in the company's mission, but because they couldn't tolerate working in an environment where every interaction felt like a potential confrontation. Victoria turned to face David, her pale eyes meeting his steady gaze. For a moment, the old Victoria Sterling would have responded with anger, would have seen his words as insubordination requiring immediate correction. But the conversation with Marcus had opened something inside her, created space for responses she had not allowed herself to consider in years. "Tell me more," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying an invitation rather than a command. "Tell me what you see that I've been missing." The simple request for honest feedback created a transformation in the atmosphere of the hallway. Other employees began to step forward, recognizing that an unprecedented opportunity for genuine communication had opened.
Sarah Martinez moved closer, her usual nervousness replaced by cautious hope. James Peterson, the night security guard, found himself drawn into the expanding circle of conversation despite having no official role in the company's operations. "You've created a culture where people are afraid to bring you problems," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "So issues that could be resolved early get buried until they become crises. Then you have to work twice as hard to fix things that could have been prevented." Victoria felt each word like a gentle slap, forcing her to confront the unintended consequences of her leadership style. She had thought that demanding perfection would result in better performance, but instead it had created an environment where people hid mistakes until they became disasters, where innovation was stifled by fear of criticism. "The talent acquisition process is broken," added Michael Torres, the HR director who had been standing at the edge of the crowd. "We're losing qualified candidates because they've heard about our culture through industry networks. People don't want to work for companies where they feel like they're walking on eggshells every day." One by one, employees who had never felt safe to speak honestly about their workplace experiences began sharing perspectives that Victoria had never heard before. They spoke about the stress of working in an environment where every mistake felt like a potential career-ending event, about the creativity that was lost when people were too afraid to propose innovative solutions, about the exhaustion that came from maintaining perfect facades instead of focusing energy on productive work. Marcus watched the transformation with professional satisfaction mixed with personal joy. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough he had facilitated countless times in his consulting career, the moment when organizational dysfunction began to heal through honest communication. But seeing it happen organically, driven by Victoria's genuine desire to understand rather than by a paid intervention, felt more meaningful than any success he had achieved in his former profession. "This is what I've been missing," Victoria said, her voice filled with wonder and regret. "All of these perspectives, all of this wisdom, and I've been too proud to ask for it." The admission created another shift in the crowd's energy. Employees who had spent years feeling undervalued and unheard began to see their CEO not as an adversary to be feared, but as a leader who might actually be capable of growth. The possibility of working for someone who valued their contributions, who saw them as partners in success rather than threats to authority, began to seem less like fantasy and more like potential reality. "It's not too late," Marcus said gently. Organizations can change as quickly as the people who lead them decide to change, but it requires consistent effort, not just good intentions. Victoria nodded, understanding that the conversation in the hallway was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward becoming the kind of leader she had originally wanted to be. She thought about the young woman who had started Sterling Dynamics with dreams of creating something meaningful, who had believed that business success and human decency were not mutually exclusive goals. "I want to learn," Victoria said, her voice carrying a humility that surprised even her. "I want to understand how to do this better, how to be someone worthy of the trust you're all placing in me by being honest." The words created a moment of profound silence, as everyone present recognized that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The Ice Queen was melting, revealing the woman who had always existed beneath the frozen exterior, and in that revelation lay the possibility of transformation for everyone who worked at Sterling Dynamics. Marcus felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the sense of purpose that had driven his career in organizational psychology. For 3 years he had pushed a cleaning cart through corporate hallways, maintaining buildings while his real talents remained hidden. But in this moment, standing before a CEO who desperately needed the kind of help he was uniquely qualified to provide, Marcus began to see possibilities he had not allowed himself to consider, since Emma's accident had redirected his life towards simpler priorities. "Change starts with courage," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided countless transformations. "The courage to admit when something isn't working, the courage to ask for help, the courage to be vulnerable enough to let people see who you really are." Victoria looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing not subjects in her corporate kingdom, but partners in a mission that could become something far greater than profit maximization. She saw David Kim's analytical mind, Sarah Martinez's organizational skills, Michael Torres's understanding of human resources, James Peterson's insights into the building's daily operations, and dozens of other talents that had been underutilized because she had been too focused on maintaining control to recognize the wealth of capability around her. "Help me," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly across the marble hallway. "Help me learn how to be better." The request hung in the air like a bridge spanning the chasm between who Victoria had been and who she might become. Around her, employees who had spent years feeling invisible in her presence began to understand that they were being offered something unprecedented, the opportunity to help shape the culture of their workplace, to contribute to something larger than their individual job responsibilities. Marcus looked at Victoria Sterling, seeing not the Ice Queen who had terrorized her employees with impossible demands, but a woman who had finally found the courage to admit that her approach to leadership needed fundamental reconstruction. He thought about Emma, now a junior at State University studying psychology and social work, who had overcome her physical limitations to become an advocate for others facing similar challenges. Emma had taught him that strength came not from avoiding vulnerability, but from finding purpose in the midst of difficulty. In that moment, standing in the marble hallway of Meridian Plaza, Marcus Chen began to consider the possibility that his years of pushing a cleaning cart had not been a retreat from his true calling, but preparation for his most important work. The woman standing before him needed exactly the kind of guidance he had spent his career providing, and the employees surrounding them deserved the kind of workplace transformation he had once been paid handsomely to facilitate. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed brighter now, illuminating faces that had been transformed by the possibility of genuine change. Victoria Sterling was no longer the untouchable CEO standing in judgment of a janitor's presumptions. She was a student ready to learn from a teacher who had appeared in the most unexpected form, offering lessons that could benefit not just her personal growth but the lives of everyone who worked at Sterling Dynamics. What happened next would determine whether this moment of breakthrough would become the foundation for lasting transformation, or simply another corporate anecdote about the day the Ice Queen showed a moment of humanity before returning to her frozen throne. But as Marcus looked into Victoria's eyes and saw genuine desire for change, he began to believe that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The revelation that followed would echo through the corridors of Meridian Plaza for years to come, transforming not just Victoria Sterling and Marcus Chen, but every person who witnessed the moment when truth finally shattered the barriers that had divided them. What began as a confrontation between CEO and janitor was about to become something far more profound, a testament to the power of authentic leadership and the courage required to embrace fundamental change. Victoria's request for help hung in the air like a prayer waiting to be answered. The employees surrounding her had never seen their CEO in a state of genuine vulnerability, and many struggled to process the transformation they were witnessing. The Ice Queen, who had ruled through fear and intimidation, was revealing herself to be someone capable of growth, someone willing to acknowledge that her approach to leadership had been fundamentally flawed. Marcus stood quietly for a moment, considering the magnitude of what Victoria was asking. She wasn't simply requesting advice about a specific business challenge or seeking consultation on a particular strategic decision. She was asking him to help her rebuild her entire approach to leadership, to become someone worthy of the trust and respect she had been demanding rather than earning. The weight of that responsibility was not lost on Marcus. He understood that the next few minutes would determine whether Sterling Dynamics continued down its current path of success built on fear, or embarked on a journey toward something more sustainable and fulfilling for everyone involved. The decision he was about to make would affect not just Victoria's personal growth, but the professional lives and emotional well-being of hundreds of employees. Leadership transformation doesn't happen in boardrooms or strategy sessions. Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided countless executives through similar journeys. It happens in moments like this, when someone finally finds the courage to admit that power without compassion is just sophisticated bullying. Victoria felt the truth of his words settle over her like cool water on sunburned skin. She had spent so many years believing that strength required isolation, that vulnerability was weakness, that being feared was more valuable than being trusted. Marcus's simple observation forced her to confront the possibility that everything she had believed about leadership was not just wrong, but actively harmful to both herself and others. "I've spent my entire career building walls," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger as she found words for feelings she had never articulated publicly. "I told myself it was necessary protection, that showing any softness would be perceived as weakness in a competitive industry. But standing here now, I realize that those walls didn't just keep others out, they kept me trapped inside, cut off from the very connections that make leadership meaningful." The crowd of observers had grown to include virtually everyone who worked on the 42nd floor, creating an unprecedented gathering that transformed the marble hallway into an impromptu forum for organizational healing. Executives stood shoulder to shoulder with administrative assistants, senior managers found themselves listening alongside maintenance workers, and the artificial hierarchies that typically governed workplace interactions began to dissolve in the face of shared humanity. James Peterson, the night security guard who had worked at Meridian Plaza longer than anyone else present, stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His uniform was different from the executive attire surrounding him, his paycheck smaller than those of the managers and directors, but his years of observation had given him insights that many higher-ranking employees lacked. "Ma'am," James said, his voice respectful but confident, "I've been working in this building for 12 years, and I've watched a lot of companies come and go. The ones that lasted weren't necessarily the ones that made the most money. They were the ones where people actually wanted to come to work every day." Victoria turned to face James, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time despite passing him in the lobby countless times over the years.
She realized that in her obsession with executive-level strategic thinking, she had overlooked the wisdom that came from ground-level operational experience, the insights of people who saw the daily reality of how corporate policies affected human lives. What makes people want to come to work? Victoria asked, her question carrying genuine curiosity rather than rhetorical challenge. What creates that kind of engagement? Feeling like what you do matters, James replied without hesitation. Knowing that your boss sees you as a person, not just a function. Understanding that mistakes are opportunities to learn, not reasons to be afraid. The simplicity of James's answer belied its profound implications for organizational culture. Victoria realized that she had been so focused on driving performance through accountability and consequences that she had forgotten to create an environment where people felt valued for their contributions rather than just evaluated on their compliance. Dr. Michael Harrison, Sterling Dynamics Head of Research and Development, found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to join the conversation. Michael had been with the company for 6 years, long enough to see his innovative proposals consistently modified or rejected based on risk assessment rather than potential impact. His department had become increasingly conservative in their recommendations, focusing on incremental improvements rather than breakthrough solutions that might challenge established thinking. "We used to dream bigger," Michael said, his voice carrying a wistfulness that surprised even him. "When I first joined Sterling Dynamics, we were developing solutions that could revolutionize how small businesses compete with larger corporations. But over time, innovation became less important than avoiding failure. We stopped taking the risks that lead to real breakthroughs." Victoria felt Michael's words like a punch to the chest, recognizing the unintended consequences of her leadership style on the very creativity and innovation that had originally driven Sterling Dynamics' success. Her insistence on perfection and predictability had created an environment where people were afraid to propose bold ideas, where the fear of failure had become more powerful than the desire for success. "I created that," Victoria admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "I made failure so costly that you stopped trying to succeed at anything meaningful."
Marcus watched the conversation unfold with professional fascination mixed with personal satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough moment he had facilitated hundreds of times in his consulting career. But seeing it happen organically felt more powerful than any intervention he had designed. Victoria was not just receiving feedback about her leadership style, she was experiencing the emotional impact of understanding how her behavior had affected the people she was supposed to be serving. Fear-based leadership creates short-term compliance, but long-term dysfunction, Marcus observed, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent studying organizational psychology. When people are afraid to fail, they also become afraid to excel. When they're afraid to bring you problems, they also become afraid to bring you opportunities. The truth of Marcus's observation resonated through the gathered crowd like a tuning fork struck in perfect pitch. Employees who had spent years walking on eggshells, carefully managing their interactions with Victoria to avoid triggering her legendary temper, began to understand that their caution had not just protected them from criticism, but had also prevented them from contributing their best thinking to the organization's success. Lisa Chen, no relation to Marcus despite sharing his surname, served as Sterling Dynamics Director of Client Relations. Lisa had joined the company 18 months earlier, recruited from a competitor specifically for her reputation as someone who could build lasting relationships with difficult clients. But her efforts to implement relationship-building strategies had been consistently undermined by Victoria's insistence on aggressive sales tactics that prioritized immediate revenue over long-term partnership development. "Our client retention rates have been declining for 2 years," Lisa said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who had solutions but lacked the authority to implement them. "We keep winning new business, but we're not keeping it. Clients tell me they feel like we see them as transactions rather than partnerships." Victoria absorbed Lisa's words with growing understanding of how her leadership philosophy had created ripple effects throughout every aspect of Sterling Dynamics operations. Her focus on short-term metrics and immediate results had not just affected employee morale, it had compromised the company's ability to build the sustainable relationships that drive long-term profitability. How do we fix it? Victoria asked, her question directed not just at Lisa, but at the entire group of employees surrounding her. How do we rebuild trust that's been broken, both internally and with our clients? The question represented a fundamental shift in Victoria's approach to problem solving. Instead of dictating solutions based on her own analysis, she was asking for input from the people who understood different aspects of the organization's challenges. Instead of assuming she had all the answers, she was acknowledging that effective solutions required multiple perspectives and collaborative thinking. Marcus recognized the significance of Victoria's question, understanding that it represented more than just a request for tactical advice. She was asking her employees to become partners in organizational transformation, to take ownership of solutions rather than simply implementing directives from above. This was exactly the kind of participatory leadership approach that research had consistently shown to be most effective in creating sustainable organizational change. Trust is rebuilt one interaction at a time, Marcus said, his voice carrying the patience of someone who understood that meaningful change required consistent effort over extended periods. It starts with acknowledging past mistakes honestly, continues with consistent demonstration of new behaviors, and is sustained by creating systems that support the values you want to embody. Victoria nodded slowly, beginning to understand that the transformation she was contemplating would require far more than good intentions or inspirational speeches. She would need to fundamentally restructure not just her own leadership approach, but the policies and procedures that had institutionalized the culture of fear and control she had created. Sarah Martinez, Victoria's executive assistant who had been contemplating resignation for months, found herself stepping closer to the center of the conversation. Sarah had observed Victoria's leadership style more intimately than anyone else in the company, had witnessed both the brilliant strategic thinking and the destructive interpersonal dynamics that characterized her approach to executive responsibilities. "You have incredible vision," Sarah said, her voice carrying both respect and honesty. "Your ability to see market opportunities and develop strategies that capitalize on them is extraordinary. But your talent for seeing possibilities in business hasn't translated into seeing potential in people." The observation hit Victoria with unexpected force, highlighting a blind spot she had never recognized in her own leadership development. She had spent years honing her ability to analyze market conditions and identify strategic opportunities, but had never applied the same analytical rigor to understanding how to unlock the potential of the people responsible for executing her strategies. "I've been treating people like resources to be optimized rather than partners to be developed," Victoria said, the realization bringing tears to her eyes for the first time in years. "I've been so focused on what I needed from everyone else that I never considered what they might need from me." The emotional breakthrough created a moment of profound silence in the marble hallway as everyone present recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The woman who had seemed incapable of genuine emotion, who had ruled through calculated intimidation and strategic manipulation, was revealing herself to be someone capable of deep feeling and authentic connection. Marcus felt his own eyes moisten as he watched Victoria's transformation, recognizing the courage it required for someone in her position to show vulnerability in front of so many people whose respect she had been demanding rather than earning. This was the moment when real change became possible, when acknowledgement of past mistakes created space for future growth. The most effective leaders I've worked with understood that their primary job was not to be the smartest person in the room, but to create conditions where everyone else could do their best thinking, Marcus said. They saw their role as removing obstacles to other people's success rather than taking credit for achievements they couldn't have accomplished alone. Victoria absorbed Marcus's words with the intensity of someone discovering a new language that finally allowed her to express feelings she had been carrying for years. She began to see leadership not as a position of authority over others, but as a responsibility for creating environments where collective intelligence could flourish. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with employees sharing perspectives they had never felt safe to express, offering solutions to problems Victoria had been trying to solve in isolation, and contributing insights that revealed the wealth of untapped potential that existed within Sterling Dynamics. What emerged was not just a critique of existing culture, but a collaborative vision for what the organization could become. David Kim, the Chief Financial Officer, proposed restructuring performance evaluation systems to reward collaboration and innovation rather than just individual achievement. Michael Harrison suggested establishing cross-functional teams that would tackle complex challenges through interdisciplinary thinking rather than departmental silos. Lisa Chen recommended implementing client feedback systems that would help the company understand relationship quality rather than just transaction volume. As the morning progressed, Victoria found herself transformed from a commander issuing orders to a facilitator helping coordinate collective problem solving. She discovered that her employees possessed far more wisdom and creativity than she had ever recognized, that their reluctance to share ideas had not reflected lack of capability, but fear of negative consequences. "This is what I've been missing," Victoria said, her voice filled with wonder and determination. "All of this intelligence, all of this passion for doing meaningful work, and I've been too proud and too scared to access it." Marcus smiled, recognizing the moment when organizational transformation shifted from possibility to inevitability. Victoria had not just acknowledged her mistakes, she had experienced the emotional impact of understanding how those mistakes had affected others, and had tasted the satisfaction that came from collaborative problem solving. There would be no going back to the old patterns of isolation and intimidation. "Change is a choice that has to be made every day," Marcus said. "Not just by you but by everyone who works here. The culture you create will be determined by the behaviors you consistently reward and the standards you consistently maintain." Victoria looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing not subjects in her corporate kingdom, but partners in a mission that could become something far greater than profit maximization. She realized that the success she had achieved through fear and control was fragile and unsustainable, built on foundations that would eventually crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. "I want to ask you something," Victoria said, her voice carrying a vulnerability that would have been unimaginable hours earlier. "I want to ask if you're willing to help me become the kind of leader you deserve, the kind of leader I should have been from the beginning." The question created another moment of profound silence as employees processed the unprecedented invitation to participate in their CEO's professional development. Many of them had spent years feeling powerless to influence the conditions of their work environment, resigned to accepting whatever culture Victoria created. The possibility of actually shaping that culture felt simultaneously exciting and overwhelming. One by one, voices began to respond to Victoria's request. Employees who had felt invisible for years stepped forward to accept the challenge of helping create something better. Managers who had been implementing policies they privately disagreed with offered to collaborate on developing more effective approaches. Even James Peterson, the night security guard whose official responsibilities had nothing to do with organizational culture, volunteered to share insights from his unique perspective on the building's daily rhythms. Marcus watched the transformation with professional satisfaction and personal joy, understanding that he was witnessing the birth of something extraordinary. The hierarchical barriers that had divided Sterling Dynamics into competing factions were dissolving, replaced by a shared commitment to creating an organization that served not just shareholders, but all stakeholders. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the marble hallway with quiet authority. "Something that might help you understand why this conversation has been possible."
Victoria turned to face Marcus fully, sensing that he was about to reveal something significant. The crowd of employees also focused their attention on the man who had somehow managed to accomplish what years of employee feedback sessions and leadership development programs had failed to achieve. Before I started working at Meridian Plaza, I spent 15 years as an organizational psychologist and executive consultant, Marcus said simply. I helped companies transform toxic cultures into thriving communities. What we've accomplished here this morning is exactly the kind of breakthrough I used to facilitate professionally. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd, as everyone present suddenly understood that the quiet janitor who had challenged their CEO possessed expertise that was directly relevant to the challenges Sterling Dynamics faced. Victoria felt her breath catch as she realized that Marcus's insights had not come from simple intuition, but from decades of professional experience in exactly the kind of transformation she desperately needed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Victoria asked, her voice mixing curiosity with something that might have been hurt. "Why let me struggle with problems you could have helped solve years ago?" Marcus considered his answer carefully, understanding that his response would shape not just Victoria's understanding of their relationship, but the future dynamic between them. "Because you weren't ready to hear it," he said gently, "and because sometimes the most important lessons can only be learned when we're humble enough to receive them from unexpected sources." The truth of Marcus's observation settled over the crowd like dawn breaking after a long night. Victoria realized that her transformation had been possible not despite Marcus's humble position, but because of it. If he had approached her as Dr. Marcus Chen, renowned consultant and Harvard graduate, she would have felt challenged and defensive. But as Marcus the janitor, he had been able to offer insights that penetrated her psychological defenses precisely because she had not perceived him as a threat to her authority. "You gave up your career," Victoria said, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. "You became someone society would overlook so that you could be available when people like me finally became ready to change." Marcus shook his head gently. "I didn't give up my career, I transformed it. Instead of helping executives in conference rooms, I've been helping people in the places where they actually live and work."
The principles are the same, but the impact is more immediate and more personal. The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of Marcus's journey from prestigious consultant to invisible janitor, the personal sacrifices he had made to provide for his daughter's medical care, and the wisdom he had gained from experiencing life from a completely different perspective. His story became a powerful example of how adversity could become a source of strength, how apparent defeat could become the foundation for more meaningful success. Victoria found herself crying openly as she listened to Marcus describe the choice between pride and dignity, between status and service, between who he had been and who his daughter needed him to become. His willingness to sacrifice prestige for principle, to choose love over luxury, challenged her fundamental assumptions about what constituted success and happiness. "You could have told me who you were at any point," Victoria said through her tears. "You could have leveraged your credentials to get a better job, more money, more recognition." "Recognition for what?" Marcus asked gently. "For having degrees and titles, or for being someone worthy of trust and respect, regardless of position or paycheck?" The question forced Victoria to confront the possibility that her entire value system had been built on false foundations, that the markers of success she had pursued so relentlessly were ultimately less important than the character she had developed or failed to develop in pursuing them. She began to understand that Marcus had gained something through his apparent losses that she had lost through her apparent victories. As the morning turned to afternoon, the impromptu gathering in the marble hallway gradually transformed into something approaching a strategic planning session. Victoria found herself asking questions rather than issuing orders, listening more than talking, learning from people whose perspectives she had been ignoring for years. Together they began sketching the outlines of a new organizational culture, one built on trust rather than fear, collaboration rather than competition, growth rather than control. The vision that emerged was not just a correction of Sterling Dynamics' existing problems, but a reimagining of what the company could become when human potential was unleashed rather than constrained. The transformation that began that morning in the marble hallway of Meridian Plaza would continue for months and years to come, as Victoria Sterling learned to become the leader she had always had the potential to be. And as Sterling Dynamics evolved into the kind of organization that attracted and retained the best people, not through financial incentives alone, but through the opportunity to do meaningful work in an environment that valued their humanity as much as their productivity. Chen would eventually accept Victoria's offer to return to organizational consulting, but this time as an internal resource helping Sterling Dynamics maintain the culture they had begun building together. His unique journey from prestigious consultant to humble janitor to trusted advisor would become a powerful reminder that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, and that the most important transformations happen not when we get what we want, but when we finally understand what we truly need. The story of their confrontation became legend throughout the corporate world, not just as an example of how authentic leadership could transform organizational culture, but as proof that courage and compassion were far more powerful than fear and control in creating sustainable success. What began as a threat to fire a janitor had become an invitation to rebuild an entire company's approach to human relationships, and in that rebuilding, everyone involved discovered possibilities they had never dared to imagine. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the same floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Plaza, but everything about the 42nd floor had fundamentally changed. The marble hallway that had once echoed with hurried footsteps and nervous whispers now buzzed with collaborative conversations and genuine laughter. Where there had once been a culture of fear, something extraordinary had taken root. Victoria Sterling stood in her corner office, reviewing quarterly reports that told a story she could hardly have imagined. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, client retention rates had improved by 40%, and innovative proposals from staff had increased by over 300%. More importantly, the company had landed its largest contract ever, a multi-million-dollar partnership with a tech startup that specifically chose Sterling Dynamics because of its reputation for treating both employees and clients as valued partners rather than mere transactions. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some employees had struggled to adapt to an environment where their input was genuinely valued, having grown accustomed to simply following orders without question. A few senior executives had left the company, unable to embrace collaborative leadership after years of operating in rigid hierarchical structures. But for every person who departed, 2 others had joined, drawn by word-of-mouth testimonials about a workplace where people could bring their whole selves to work without fear of judgment or retaliation. Victoria had kept her promise to change, but it had required more than good intentions. She had enrolled in executive coaching sessions with Marcus, meeting weekly to discuss specific situations where her old patterns of behavior threatened to resurface. She had implemented new policies that required decision-making input from multiple levels of the organization, ensuring that important choices reflected diverse perspectives rather than single-person directives. Most significantly, Victoria had learned to see mistakes as learning opportunities rather than failures to be punished. When the marketing team's experimental campaign for a major client fell short of expectations, instead of assigning blame and demanding explanations, Victoria had gathered the entire team to analyze what hadn't worked and extract lessons that could improve future efforts. The result was not just better marketing strategies, but a team that felt empowered to take creative risks because they knew failure would be met with support rather than criticism. Marcus had officially returned to consulting, but his office was just down the hall from Victoria's, and his door remained open to any employee seeking guidance or simply someone to listen.
His unique journey from executive consultant to janitor to trusted advisor had given him credibility with people at every level of the organization. Maintenance staff felt comfortable approaching him with operational insights, while senior executives valued his perspective on complex strategic challenges. The most profound change, however, was visible in Victoria herself. The rigid posture and cold demeanor that had earned her the Ice Queen nickname had been replaced by genuine warmth and authentic engagement. She remembered employees' names, asked about their families, and celebrated their achievements with sincere enthusiasm. The woman who had once ruled through intimidation had discovered that leading through inspiration was not only more effective but infinitely more fulfilling. Chen had become a regular visitor to Sterling Dynamics, her internship in the company's new employee wellness division, allowing her to apply her psychology studies in real-world settings. Her research project on workplace culture transformation was being cited by organizational development professionals across the country, and several universities had requested permission to use Sterling Dynamics as a case study for their business programs. The ripple effects of that morning confrontation in the marble hallway had spread far beyond the walls of Sterling Dynamics. Other companies began reaching out to Victoria, seeking advice on how to transform toxic cultures into thriving communities. Industry publications featured articles about the radical leadership transformation that had resulted in measurable business improvements, and Victoria found herself speaking at conferences about the power of vulnerable, authentic leadership. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Victoria had reconnected with her sister, the relationship slowly healing as Victoria learned to prioritize human connections alongside professional achievements. She had begun dating for the first time in years, allowing herself to be vulnerable with someone who valued her humanity more than her corporate success. Most surprisingly, she had discovered hobbies and interests outside of work, finding joy in activities that had nothing to do with profit margins or strategic planning. James Peterson, the night security guard whose simple observation about wanting to come to work had contributed to the transformation, had been promoted to Director of Facilities, his years of ground-level observation qualifying him to manage the building's operations with unprecedented effectiveness. His insights about employee needs and workplace dynamics had proven invaluable in creating physical spaces that supported collaboration and well-being. Sarah Martinez had evolved from executive assistant to chief of staff, her organizational skills and understanding of company culture making her instrumental in implementing the changes that Victoria had committed to making. Instead of managing Victoria's schedule and buffering her from employee concerns, Sarah now facilitated communication between leadership and staff, ensuring that voices at all levels of the organization were heard and valued. The conference room where Victoria had once conducted intimidating performance reviews had been redesigned as a collaborative workspace where cross-functional teams gathered to tackle complex challenges. The rigid hierarchical seating arrangements had been replaced with flexible configurations that encouraged equal participation regardless of job title or seniority. David Kin, the CFO, whose honest feedback had helped initiate Victoria's transformation, had implemented innovative financial tracking systems that measured not just traditional profit metrics, but also indicators of employee engagement and client satisfaction. His reports now included data on retention rates, professional development investments, and community impact, providing a more comprehensive picture of the company's true health and sustainability. Lisa Chen had revolutionized Sterling Dynamics' approach to client relationships, implementing partnership models that prioritized long-term value creation over short-term revenue extraction. Her department had become a model for other consulting firms seeking to build more sustainable and meaningful business relationships. Dr. Michael Harrison's research and development team had experienced a renaissance of innovation, their proposals no longer constrained by fear of failure, but empowered by an organizational culture that viewed experimentation as essential to growth. Their latest breakthrough in small business automation technology was being hailed as revolutionary, with potential applications that could transform how independent entrepreneurs compete with larger corporations. The marble hallway where everything had changed now featured a simple plaque that read, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it." Victoria had commissioned the installation not as a monument to her own transformation, but as a reminder to everyone who worked there that change was always possible for those brave enough to embrace it. Marcus often paused by that plaque during his walks through the building, remembering the morning when two people from completely different worlds had found the courage to see each other's humanity. His work at Sterling Dynamics had become a model for organizational transformation, demonstrating that sustainable change required not just new policies or procedures, but fundamental shifts in how people related to each other. The company's success had attracted attention from business schools and leadership development programs, with professors and consultants studying the transformation as an example of how authentic leadership could drive both cultural change and business results. But Marcus always emphasized that the real lesson was simpler than most academic analyses suggested. People thrived when they felt valued, respected, and empowered to contribute their best thinking to shared goals. Victoria's approach to leadership had become a case study in vulnerability as strength, demonstrating that admitting uncertainty and asking for help were not signs of weakness but evidence of wisdom. Her willingness to acknowledge past mistakes and commit to ongoing growth had created an organizational culture where continuous learning was valued over the pretense of having all the answers. The transformation had not been without its critics. Some business commentators argued that Victoria's soft approach to leadership would ultimately undermine Sterling Dynamics' competitive edge, predicting that competitors who maintained traditional command and control structures would eventually outperform the company. But the results spoke for themselves. Sterling Dynamics was growing faster, retaining talent more effectively, and developing innovative solutions more consistently than ever before in its history. More importantly, the people who worked there were happier, healthier, and more engaged than employees at most comparable firms. Exit interviews revealed that people who left Sterling Dynamics typically did so for personal reasons rather than workplace dissatisfaction, and many maintained relationships with former colleagues long after departing. The company had become known not just for its business success but for its positive impact on people's lives and careers. As Victoria reflected on the journey from that confrontational morning to the thriving organization Sterling Dynamics had become, she was struck by how a single moment of courage had created possibilities she never could have imagined. Her willingness to listen to Marcus, to accept feedback from employees, and to acknowledge her own limitations had unlocked potential that had always existed but had been suppressed by fear and rigid thinking. The Ice Queen was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came from empowering others rather than controlling them, that lasting success was built on trust rather than intimidation, and that the most powerful leadership tool was not authority but authenticity. Victoria Sterling had discovered that being vulnerable enough to ask for help was not a sign of weakness but the beginning of wisdom. Marcus continued his work as both consultant and mentor, his unique perspective as someone who had experienced both the heights of professional success and the humility of service giving him credibility with leaders at every level. His story had become an inspiration to executives facing their own moments of reckoning, proof that it was never too late to choose a different path. The legacy of that morning confrontation in the marble hallway extended far beyond Sterling Dynamics, inspiring leaders in other organizations to examine their own approaches to power and responsibility. The story had become a reminder that transformation was always possible, that courage could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from the people we were least likely to listen to. Chen graduated summa cum laude and immediately began her doctoral studies, her research focusing on workplace culture transformation and the psychology of authentic leadership. Her father's journey had inspired her own career path, and she was determined to help other organizations discover the power of leading with both strength and compassion. The marble hallway of Meridian Plaza remained a place where important conversations happened, where problems were solved collaboratively, and where people from different levels of the organization gathered to share ideas and support each other's growth. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people found the courage to see beyond job titles and hierarchies to the shared humanity that connected them all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.